Hello and welcome to another edition of Inside the Lab with the CMBC. My name is Dietrich Stout and I'm the Associate Director of the CMBC. And today I'll be talking with Ben Wilson, who has just joined Emory as an assistant professor with a dual appointment in psychology and at the Yerkes Primate Center. So Dr. Wilson is a comparative cognitive scientist. He's interested in working with non-human primates to better understand what makes humans unique. And I know that he has a particular interest in the evolution of the human capacity for language. So Ben, could you tell us a little bit more about your interests and what's currently going on inside your lab?
Yes, well, firstly, thank you for having me. It's great to be here to talk to you today. Yes, so I'm a comparative cognitive scientist, comparative neuroscientist. I am very interested in studying humans and other primates, trying to understand what cognitive systems and what neural systems that support them might be shared between different primate species and where we may see differences, particularly when those differences might relate to things that we think of as uniquely human, particularly things like language. I think by taking an approach that combines comparative behavioral work in humans and monkeys, but also neuroimaging approaches across the species, we can start to try and identify not only those behaviors and the cognitive mechanisms that might be similar, but also the neural substrates that support them. And by combining those, we can start to get a good idea of how the brains of primates may have changed over evolutionary time and how those changes may support the different abilities we see across different primate species. Regarding what's going on in the lab, so my official appointment started at Emory in March. However, due to the current situation in the world, I've actually only been in Atlanta for the last 6 weeks. So we're still in sort of quite early stages of getting things set up in the lab. But in the near future, we aim to be in a position where we can do direct comparative experiments using very similar paradigms and procedures in both humans and monkeys. We're doing a lot of work using touchscreen computers that both humans and monkeys find very easy to interact with, and they give us the flexibility and the versatility to ask a huge range of different questions about learning and about memory and problem solving and decision making. And also in the future to be able to do MRI in very similar ways again across the species. This includes functional MRI, so we can look at the brain areas that are involved while animals, whether they be human or non-human primate, are participating in identical tasks to again give us a better insight into where we see similarities and again differences across the species.
Yeah, cool. So that was going to be my question about the comparative thing. Does that mean you actually work both with humans and with monkeys, or you work with the monkeys and compare them to work that other people do with humans? So, but have you done this in the past, where you work actually with both species in the same study?
Yes, and I think it's really important for the sort of work that I'm doing. I think that people may have the sort of assumption that if you run an experiment and a monkey is able to do it, well, then obviously people will be able to do it. But I think that kind of sometimes misses the point that humans and monkeys might show different strategies. They might learn things in different ways. And without having a clear understanding of exactly how people learn, it's difficult to match that to non-human primates. It's also quite difficult in some cases to take work that's already been done in the human literature and apply that directly to monkeys, because you often have to make so many changes to the design of experiments just to make it compatible to work with non-human primates, that you're then kind of comparing apples to oranges, and the species comparison becomes a lot more difficult to make. As one example, there was a really nice paradigm that has been used to study artificial grammar learning, so how we detect the regularities within a small made-up language to give us some insights into how humans might learn real language. There was a really nice study that was done in human adults, but it used linguistic stimuli. You had to be able to read words. Obviously, that doesn't work with non-human primates. So with one of my students in the UK, we've done 3 different versions of that, first using sort of familiar objects, then using more abstract shapes. So taking the core idea that was originally designed to work with humans and developing it in a way that doesn't require those linguistic abilities that are absent in primates, to allow us to then perform a direct cross-species approach and to see whether or not the species may perform similarly or differently with the tasks as similar as they possibly can be.
Right, yeah. So could you maybe talk a little bit more about that? Because I mean, just, to take a step back, you say, I want to study language, I'm going to use monkeys. Well, monkeys can't talk, and you just talked about, well, we have to adapt it so it's something that doesn't involve language. So how can that tell you anything about human language if you have to translate it into a non-linguistic paradigm to get them to do it?
That's a really good question, and one that I get all of the time. So the starting point I would normally begin with is that obviously language as it's typically defined and sort of as a system of human communication is uniquely human. There are no other species that communicate like we do. They don't have words, they don't have syntax and grammar in the same sorts of way. So that does immediately present a problem if you're a comparative scientist and you're interested in language. So the approach that I've always taken has been trying to ask, well, what are the kind of key cognitive systems that you might require to get to the point where you have language? What are the kind of underpinnings and the fundamental systems that you would need in order to have language? If we break language down and think about something like syntax and grammar, so the ability to understand that the order of words in a sentence affects the meaning of that sentence, well, a prerequisite to that might be understanding that the order of stimuli in a sequence can be meaningful, and that certain orders of stimuli may be allowed and certain others may not, and the order of those stimuli may change the meaning of the sequence or how you should respond or something like that. This has been studied in humans for a long time, since the late 60s, using artificial grammar learning studies that try and tap into some of the kind of core basic mechanisms that underpin aspects of human syntax. There's also been a lot of work using MRI, for example, but also EEG, other neuroimaging techniques that show that these kind of tasks engage some of the same brain areas as real language do. So although these tasks are clearly not language, they do engage some of the same cognitive and neural systems that language engages. There are also other questions that we could ask about different features of language. So a critical aspect of language is obviously semantics, the fact that words have meanings, that we can use these words to refer to objects and ideas and actions out there in the real world. Monkeys don't do that. They have maybe alarm calls that in certain contexts refer to certain predators, but they don't use them in as flexible and creative ways as humans do. And they certainly don't make up new vocalizations that refer to new incidents, new events, new objects in the same way that humans do. But would it be possible to design an experiment where we ask them to learn that a certain symbol or word or some other stimulus corresponds to another object or action out there in the real world? And if they were able to learn that, would that give us some insights about the basic prerequisites for semantics that might be shared more broadly across species, even though clearly the whole of language doesn't exist in other species? I think by taking this kind of approach and looking at all of the different abilities that might be required for human language, and I think importantly must have evolved at some point before the whole of language evolved, that there must have been evolutionary precursors as well as cognitive ones, we can get a really clear understanding of what is shared and what is absent. That's kind of what I mean, that some aspects of the cognitive faculty of language may exist in non-human primates, even though the whole sort of emergent phenomenon of language doesn't exist in non-human primates.
Right. So you mentioned a sort of as a hypothetical an experiment to test monkey semantic abilities. It would surprise me that that hasn't actually already been done. I mean, it sounded like a fairly straightforward kind of thing. And well, has that been done? Have you done that? And is there any sort of disjunct between kind of doing a bunch of associative learning and the kind of like sort of symbolic structured meaning that humans have?
Sure. Yes. So, of course, this isn't a new idea. I'm not the first person to think of this. And the clear examples are going back to the great ape language projects that have been done across all species of great apes, with sort of Koko the gorilla, Kanzi the bonobo, Nim Chimpsky, all being taught to learn symbols, whether those be sign language gestures or pictograms in the case of someone like Kanzi, that refer to things, and they can use them in interesting and sometimes creative ways. There are reports of them using them in particularly interesting ways, combining them into novel constructions, novel sentences, as it were, to refer to wanting to go outside or wanting a particular toy, or expressing excitement or some other emotion in a given situation. Those are very cool, very exciting projects. We've actually got some collaborations set up to work with the bonobo, with some bonobos, including Kanzi, who's a famous language-trained ape, who's currently living in Iowa at the Ape Initiative, which is a bonobo conservation and research facility. So there's some work that we want to do there. I think the key thing that I would like to add to this is not only see what they would naturally produce given free access to something like a lexigram or some other system of communication, maybe like sign language in the case of some of the other species, but to do this in a sort of more experimental setting and sort of push how far they can learn if we design experiments that really sort of probe and try to provide some extra motivation to learn sort of the try to make them learn the different types of stimuli that we're interested in. The additional thing that I would like to add to this is if they can do even some basic kind of understanding, maybe through associative learning, that certain words correspond to certain objects, can we then begin combining those together to produce something that looks more like a slightly more meaningful artificial language? So if you have a word for, to take a very simple example, red and square, can you understand the novel construction of red square? That sounds really quite straightforward, but it's actually a somewhat more difficult prospect if you're a non-human primate. And I think by doing it in a slightly more experimental setting, that allows us to ask really cool questions cross-species. So for example, might you see differences in how a bonobo learns these kind of things compared to how a macaque learns them? And that's very difficult to do if you look in the cases of the sort of previous great ape work, where someone like Hansi has 40 years of experience of working with these symbols. And I think it's very difficult to imagine how we're going to replicate that with the macaques that we have here at Yerkes and Emory.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm glad you brought up that sort of the combinatorial semantics, you know, where it's not just associations, but mapping new associations between tokens, kind of thing. And yeah, I mean, as far as I know, like we have the anecdotal stuff like Waterbird from Coco is suggesting this might be possible, but is that distinct from this combination, semantic combination versus syntactic combination? Are those really two different things for you that we can tease apart and examine? You know, could be possible that monkeys would have one and not the other. You know, sort of the syntax and semantics thing. Are they really two separate processes?
So I think that's a very big question. I think there's a lot going on there. What I think is going on in the traditional artificial grammar learning experiments, where a lot of my background lies, where you have to recognize the order of stimuli, and that we've argued may relate to aspects of syntax, is that is purely sort of perceptual. It's understanding that certain elements in a sequence may go together more frequently, or some elements never co-occur. In the animal world, this has been kind of compared to what's described as phonological syntax that, for example, songbirds use, where they might recognize the order of motifs in a song, but the order of those motifs doesn't change the meaning of the song. They're learning the relationships and the rules, but they aren't necessarily using them in a meaningful way. So I think that's kind of the side of the work that we have done previously. I think if you can add some sort of meaning to it, you move towards something more like human sort of semantic combinations. They are still going to be very different to that. And I don't want to overstate things and say, if we can teach a monkey to understand what red circle means, then we've solved language evolution. It's clearly a lot bigger and there's a lot more going on than that. But I think it moves us in the right direction. I think that there are huge open questions, and they are beyond my current research program, but they are interesting questions to answer in the future, about the nature of the symbolic representations that non-human primates might have. Do they have concepts in the same way that humans have concepts? And are they simply learning associations between stimuli, whether that be a word or a symbol and a visual or a physical object? And do they understand that like humans do? We have some work in the planning with my current grad student here at Emory, looking at category formation in monkeys and how monkeys may be able to understand that actually we don't only need to learn associations between a specific stimulus and another stimulus, but these stimuli can be grouped into broader categories, and do those categories then share relationships between them? The language analog there being maybe something like how we can make predictions about the structure of a sentence based on understanding the relationship between nouns and verbs better than between the specific words within that sentence. Even that, though, is kind of simplistic compared to what humans are doing. Those experiments we're planning on using categories where the members of each category share perceptual features. So you may have, as an example, spiky shapes versus rounded shapes, and can you learn associations between those, which is quite different to learning something like the members of the category of nouns versus verbs, which are not dictated based on any perceptual features, but on sort of the learned category membership. So there are a lot of open questions, and none of the experiments that I'm going to do will answer all of them, but I hope all of the experiments will move us slightly closer to understanding what monkeys can and can't do. And again, I think it's really important to understand what they can't do as well as what they can. I don't necessarily think that we're going to get to a point where all we need to do is design an experiment that allows us to test this correctly to show that monkeys will necessarily be able to do everything. We might find things that monkeys just really struggle to do. And I mean, that's quite exciting too, if we're interested in identifying aspects of human uniqueness when it comes to something like language.
Yeah, I mean that's that's what makes it an interesting thing to do, right? It's pretty challenging to sort these things out. And what what you just said, there's a kind of a couple questions that come out of that. The one is just given that you have to make an artificial paradigm to study these things with the monkeys and humans in the lab, and that there's maybe more than one way to solve a problem. What can you do to make yourself more confident that just because the monkey learned to solve the task that you've designed, that they solved it like in the same way that a person does, or the same way that a person outside the lab uses natural language as opposed to what they do when they're sitting in a scanner. And I'm just thinking of these. They did do some sort of informal experiments with the language apes early on, where they got them to put things into categories, and it took thousands and thousands of trials. And it just suggests that although they eventually learned to categorize these things, that the way they did that was completely different, than the way people do. And so that's one question. Like, what can you do to feel better that because they've solved the behavior paradigm, or they're really doing it in the same way?
I think that's a really good question. It's a big question again. So we do a few things. One of the things is try to have a task that doesn't just have a simple you passed or you failed, that you didn't necessarily just get it correct or not. But if we use a large range of stimuli, that allows us to ask where mistakes are made and how quickly learning may occur for these different types of stimuli. And that lets us try and sort of titrate what about the artificial grammar or the rules of the experiment has been learned. And we can do that identically in humans and monkeys. We've done some previous work showing that humans and monkeys seem to use fairly similar properties of the sequences. And these often tie to the statistical regularities within the sequences. Both species are very sensitive to statistical properties of the sequences we're presenting, which kind of makes sense because I think that a lot of these tasks tap into fairly simple abilities to sort of recognize regularities in the environment, to understand that one event is likely to predict another. That would obviously be adaptive to any animal and isn't only used in language, although there is a lot of work going back for the last 20 years showing that those statistical learning abilities are important in language acquisition and also language processing, even in adult language users. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily entirely the same. So one of the things that I think is really important is combining these behavioral experiments with the neuroimaging work, because I think it's very possible that you could see similar looking behavioral performance in some humans and some monkeys, but find that they're solving them in very different ways, because maybe the humans are relying on some sort of neural language system, or I guess cognitive language system, that the monkeys don't have access to. And even though they might produce quite similar behavioral outputs, you may end up in a situation where they're supported by fundamentally different neural systems. If we do the comparative MRI, we can start asking, well, which brain areas are engaged while you're doing these tasks, and how does the brain represent this information? And we can see whether we see similarities or differences across the species. And this is one of the things that we've done in the past using the artificial grammar learning work. And in most of these cases, we do find some differences across the species. I'm certainly not arguing that monkeys are basically the same as humans. There are clearly some differences there, but there are really clear core similarities. And we have argued that, in fact, some of these tasks are supported by evolutionarily conserved brain areas that have been present for a long time, a long evolutionary time, at least the last 25 million years, and have more recently been co-opted for language functions in humans, but are still present and serving other functions in non-human primates. So I think that gets some of the way to addressing whether they're learning things similarly or differently. But to come to sort of the final point of your question, yes, in some of these tasks that other people have done and we are intending to do in the lab, where you train animals to learn a certain sort of task or a certain artificial language, it takes thousands and thousands of trials, and humans often learn things much, much more rapidly. My starting point with the non-human primate work has often been asking not what do monkeys naturally do, although that's obviously a really important question. I'm very glad there are other people answering that, but what are they capable of doing if we give them all of the tools to be able to do? So almost asking what are the upper cognitive limits of what monkeys are capable of doing. So if a monkey is able to solve a task, but it takes them 20,000 trials, I still think that tells us something really interesting. But one of the things it clearly tells us is monkeys do not learn it as quickly or as intuitively as humans probably do. I think that I could speculate about some of the reasons for why that might be the case in some of these situations. I think that I think that when you have a system like language that is so valuable to the social structure that you live in, but is also so obviously and constantly reinforced in that you get a huge social reward from communicating with other people. You get feedback when you are not correctly understood, and that shapes the language that you're using. I think that kind of iterative process of use and learning over the whole course of human life is something that we can't sort of separate out from, well, it's something that is clearly not present in non-human primates. So even if they had some of the core cognitive capacities for language, the fact that they don't have language use as a huge part of their lives for many, many, many years before we begin testing them represents another difference between humans and monkeys that is very difficult to overcome. So I think all of these results can provide some cool insights about what animals are capable of, and in some cases what they're not capable of, but they do have to be taken with a big pinch of salt because there are such clear species differences that we can't sort of experimentally rule out.
Right, yeah, and so there, it's really right at the tail end of your answer, you also brought up the other thing I was thinking about, which is the sort of the negative results, right? And where you design this clever paradigm and the monkeys just don't get it, you know, and you want to, oh, well, they don't have the computational machinery for center embedding or some, whatever you wanted to make a conclusion about. But, you know, is there anything you can, they could be just, maybe they're not motivated, right? It's the classic one, or maybe it's seen as an experience effect of, you know, their upbringing, rearing environment, whatever, compared to humans, and like given the proper environment, they would have, you know, can you ever rule those things out, or is a negative result always just kind of floating out there as, or maybe it was actually their hearing wasn't acute enough, not that they weren't able to do this, you know, syntactical processing?
I don't think I would ever take a single negative result as evidence that an animal couldn't do a task, because again, absence of evidence doesn't produce absence of learning in this kind of case. The example that you mentioned of failure to do center embedding is the very salient one in the field that I've worked in. So people may not be as familiar, people listening to this may not be as familiar with the work. There was a famous study in 2004 that argued that non-human primates can learn a relatively simple grammar in which one word predicts the next word in a sentence. And cotton-top tamarins were able to do this very easily, as were humans. It's a fairly easy task, and that's been replicated many, many times. But they argued that monkeys couldn't do a more complex grammar where you had some series of, where you had a sentence which was meant to emulate something containing a center embedding, which would be similar to a sentence like the cat, the dog bit ran away, where you have to track relationships across the whole sentence and understand who did what to whom. It's actually simpler than that. There were no semantics in their task. It was just understanding a basic sequence of the form A, B, B, where you had to understand that the number of A's and B's match and that there were some relationships between those. That paper in 2004 has sparked more literature than pretty much anything else in our field, with several attempts by many different groups trying to show that maybe monkeys can learn it, evidence that songbirds can learn it under certain conditions, but then rebuttals saying, well, actually, maybe they were using simpler strategies and maybe that's not similar to what the humans are doing. Again, going back to the point you were making, how do we know that they're really doing it in the same way and whether it corresponds to language? This has been going on with very little resolution in sight for quite a long time. However, in 2018, a paper came out showing that a similar grammar, although learned in a very different modality, could be learned by non-human primates. This was done using a motor sequencing task. So instead of just listening to auditory stimuli, you have to actually generate sequences of responses on a touchscreen computer, but they conform to the same underlying grammar. And they showed that macaques were not only able to learn this, but with enough training, they could learn it to staggeringly high levels. This was sort of, these animals were making a few mistakes across thousands of trials. The learning was so sort of robust, there was very little doubt that it was working. And now you could argue that, well, that's fundamentally very different because the nature of the stimuli are so different. It's not in the auditory domain anymore. The use of the motor system may be changing how it's represented. But the general argument was monkeys apparently, in certain contexts, do have the ability to learn this kind of grammar, even though we've spent 15 years assuming that maybe they don't. I think that just goes some way to sort of show we should be a little bit careful about making claims based on null results that monkeys don't have some ability, and particularly for framing them in the context of, and therefore this ability must be uniquely human, or this is the ability that makes humans unique. I think that's quite dangerous. As I said when I was talking about our MRI results, we have sometimes found some differences between the species, but again, as you sort of alluded to, I think it's really difficult to identify whether those differences in neural responses are due to real species differences or some other differences between how the animals are tested. Because while we try and do everything as similarly as possible, there are differences between humans and monkeys. And even though we're collecting exactly the same bold signal from the brains of humans and monkeys, the setups are very different. Monkeys are being rewarded with fruit juice because we have to give them some sort of treats to motivate them to continue the experiment, while humans aren't. Humans understand what the experiment is about in a way that maybe monkeys don't. The monkeys have hundreds of hours of training in an MRI scanner because that's what's required to get a monkey comfortable in an MRI scanner, whereas humans are just willing undergraduates who we've brought in to do our experiment. I wouldn't be comfortable saying that a small difference that we see in a single study is definitely evidence that humans have some ability or their brain responds in a certain way that is clearly different to monkeys, until we did a lot more rigorous work to try and rule out the other possibilities and the other methodological differences that could have given rise to any of those problems. Or not problems, differences. They're not problems. They can be really insightful, but it's still important to consider.
Yeah, so I actually have a follow-on to that, but before I don't want to leave this. What's it like trying to get monkeys in MRI scanners? It can't be easy.
Slow, very slow. I think if you imagine what going in an MRI scanner feels like, if you've ever been in one or you've never seen one, if no one had explained to you beforehand what was going to happen, that would seem very scary even to a human. I think you're going to lie down and then you're going to slide into you're going to have equipment placed around your head, the coils, the headphones that we use for auditory stimuli. Then you slide into a dark scanner and then you hear a lot of really loud noises and you're there in a claustrophobic environment for a prolonged period of time. I think it's understandable that that's as intimidating for a monkey as it is for a human if the human wasn't prepared for it. You know, we actually have mock scanners that we use when we're working with patients in clinical situations. Certainly there are some patients who are very uncomfortable with MRI scans, and we don't want to jeopardize the sort of real data collection that we're doing in those experiments. So we slowly train those patients with our mock scanner in a sort of much more low pressure environment to show them what they're going to experience and show them that although it is a little claustrophobic, there's nothing to be worried about. It's actually very safe and reasonably comfortable, and that there isn't any reason to be overly concerned. We can't explain that to the monkeys. We can't tell them what's going to happen, but we can very slowly walk them through all of the steps that they're going to encounter. That's everything from first sitting in their primate chair. So when we did scanning in the UK, although this is slightly different at Yerkes, we have a vertical bore scanner. So the monkey sits in a primate chair, which is effectively a big tube with a seat in it that the monkey can sit in really comfortably. That takes a while to train them to, but they get used to it very quickly. Effectively, you get them to sit in the chair and then you give them loads of rewards to the point where they start associating the chair with, this is the place where I go and I get lots of grapes, and they quickly become quite happy with that. We then have to start introducing them to just moving to the lab because that's something they haven't done before, and going to a new unknown space can be difficult for a monkey. But again, with sufficient positive reinforcement and reward, they get used to it. We have to slowly and gradually introduce any of the things that they might find uncomfortable or sort of stressful. This includes things like the imaging coils that have to go around their head. That's how we actually collect the data, headphones, things like that. Again, all of these individually are not particularly intimidating to a monkey. It's just the combination of all of them suddenly at once becomes very overwhelming. We do things like emulate the sound of the scanner, so slowly introducing the sound of the scanner noise while they're doing a task in a lab, so it becomes more and more natural and it just becomes part of what they're doing. And then when we actually get to the final challenging part of introducing them to the scanner, we obviously have to do that at first very briefly. So we put them into the scanner for only a few seconds, and then you bring them out and you give them lots of treats, and they recognize that wasn't such a stressful event. And over time, we can get them to the point where they quite comfortably will sit in the scanner, and we can collect imaging data for normally up to sort of 3 hours at a time with the monkeys, which is longer than I would ever normally go with a human. It does require a lot of sort of experience and sensitivity, I think, to the individual monkeys, because every monkey I've trained has stumbling blocks in different places to other animals, and you need to be quite aware of what a stressed out monkey looks like compared to a comfortable monkey. So you can go, oh, although my previous animals had no problem with this stage, this monkey may be struggling a little bit more, so we should take it slowly. We should provide more reinforcement. We should try and make sure they're as comfortable as they possibly can be, because obviously from a welfare point of view, but even from a scientific point of view, there is no point of putting a stressed animal into an MRI scanner. They're going to have a terrible time and we're not going to get any useful data. So it behooves everybody to make sure that the experience is as comfortable and as pleasant as possible for the animals and for the experimenters.
I'm impressed because, you know, I've done a little bit of work with, you know, human participants in the MRI, and it's not even easy to get people to get good images from them. So that's pretty impressive. I mentioned I did have something I wanted to return to, but as long as we're talking a little bit about methods, I think you do a lot of work with artificial grammar learning, and you've mentioned it a bunch of times, and probably also some of the people watching this wouldn't be familiar with that. Can you talk a little bit about what that paradigm is, how you do it with monkeys?
Yes. So the artificial grammar learning paradigms came out of the implicit learning literature of the 60s. The idea is that a lot of what we learn is not learned consciously, and it's not sort of accessible in an explicit conscious way. Instead, we recognize regularities in the stimuli that we are presented with, in the environmental events, or in the artificial cases of stimuli we're presenting in these tasks. So the experiments work that we begin with a training phase or an exposure phase where we present our participants with strings of stimuli. These could be auditory or visual, that conform to some sort of patterns or rules, but the participants have no idea what those rules are. The idea is over a period of time, they will implicitly learn some of those rules, and we can then try and assess how well they've learned it, or which rules they may have picked up on, and how well they understand the grammar. We then have a testing phase where we'll present sequences that, again, conform to the grammar. These are well-formed or grammatical sequences, and some other sequences which are ungrammatical but don't follow the grammatical rules. By designing those carefully, we can make inferences about what aspects of the grammar may have been learned, and how that may vary across the species. There are many different ways of testing this. I started out using an approach that is derived from the infant literature, really, where you passively expose our monkeys to the stimuli. They just sit and listen to streams of auditory stimuli. And then from concealed audio speakers, we infrequently present a sequence that is either grammatical or ungrammatical. The idea is that surprising, unexpected stimuli elicit larger responses in non-human primates, humans as well, actually, than predictable ones. So if they hear a sequence that contains an unexpected regularity, they might be more likely to make a looking response to orient towards the speaker, and we can take that as evidence that they have recognized at least something about the structure of the artificial grammar. We did that for a while using the sort of traditional approach where we just concealed these speakers in the animal's home colony. We videotaped them. We got multiple raters to come in and check what constituted a response and how long the animals were responding for. It's a large amount of work coding those videos, and I always felt that however well you do that work, there is an inherent level of subjectivity to it, because we are deciding at some point what constitutes a response. So during my PhD, I developed an approach that did the same thing using eye tracking. So we have a monkey that sat in front of a computer with an eye tracker. And again, we start presenting sounds, these test sequences, from different places in sort of auditory space. And we measure looking responses in the directions of those stimuli. And that, again, works very well. Interestingly, that works very well for monkeys. I did exactly the same experiment in humans, and it failed fairly completely. It turns out if you take adult human participants and sit them in front of a computer, they don't feel any need to make looking responses to the speaker that is producing a sound. They understand how speakers work, so you don't see the same effect, even though we could later confirm that learning had taken place by doing a sort of standard grammaticality judgment task. And the final way, obviously, that we look at these at this learning, and one of the real advantages of the fMRI approach, is to use brain imaging. So even with no task at all, we can put a human or a monkey in an MRI scanner. We can present them with these sequences, which are either grammatical or ungrammatical. We can look at how the brain responds to those two different conditions, and the contrast between those shows the areas of the brain that are involved in detecting and processing those grammatical rules. Critically, that's exactly the same approach that is used in the human literature as well. This isn't anything developed to work with non-human primates, but showing that we can use the same kind of strategies that have worked well for the last 20 years in the human world, and now just by the addition of extra training and some methodological developments, we can apply them to non-human primates as well.
Yeah. Again, it sounds like a lot of work, but very interesting. So in these artificial grammars, like, you can make any grammar that you want, basically, right? You've talked a lot about sequence learning, and people may be thinking, yeah, well, language isn't really sequences, it's structured. And I know that there are a lot of people that feel that the real, clear disjunction between humans and everybody else is that, we have this capacity to build structured, self-embedded recursive trees. And what do you think of that? I mean, is there clearly monkeys and humans can, like chunk stimuli together, they can recognize some basic sequences and that kind of thing. But is there a big difference in your mind in the sort of recursive embedding capability that humans have?
Yes, and I hope that doesn't annoy any of my collaborators. I do. I think there's a big difference. And I think as much as I am kind of willing to advocate for the abilities of non-human primates, it's ridiculous to suggest that they are similar to humans in terms of some of these abilities that relate to language. The center embedding work that I was talking about earlier, this 2-decade-long controversy about whether monkeys can learn those particular constructions, that was particularly interesting because it relates to this ability to sort of recursively embed information. The problem, or one of the issues I have with that, is that the tasks that we use to measure it are so artificial, and I'm not necessarily sure that even in humans it's tapping into the capacities that are really central to language. If we look at cases where we do produce these really structured, recursive, hierarchical sequences, the only examples that I can really think of, language is obviously the key one, where the relations between those stimuli, in this case words, are the semantic relations and the syntactic relations between words in a sentence, but also potentially things like sequences of motor actions, where you can imagine a situation where if you have to open a drawer and you take something out, then you have to put it back in the drawer before you close the drawer, and you end up with this center embedded looking sequence of actions. I think that is probably much more ancestral, much more likely to be shared. I think that's probably why the 2018 paper that I mentioned showed that monkeys were able to do tasks like this in the motor domain, because being able to produce complex sequence of actions, well, suddenly that sounds something like something that monkeys are much more likely to do. If you've ever seen monkeys sort of like moving through a forest canopy, it's not surprising at all. They can produce really elaborate sequences of actions, maybe not necessarily to the same level of complexity as certain human tasks. I'm thinking of things like music, where I can't imagine an animal able to do something like play a piano, but you could imagine that the core aspects of that may be there. I think one of the real challenges to this is that the cases where humans use this real recursive capacity the most seem to be language, but does the fact that there is something almost slightly circular here. We can do these recursive operations on our language knowledge because we kind of have this way of representing things out there in the world, these like objects, actions, events. And when you have access to that, we can start performing these operations on them. You can maybe do something similar in maths, but again, you need this kind of abstract representation of the information which you are processing. I am not yet 100% sure whether I think that monkeys don't have the ability to do the recursive operations. The fact that they can potentially do it in motor domains may speak to that, or whether they don't have the concepts the concepts to process with that recursive system. I think it's probably a little of both. I think the fact that some early humans clearly have some sort of form of proto-language or something that would be more complex than our extant primate cousins have, but is less complex than full human language we have now. But once you had something like that, there would clearly be a very rapid sort of cultural selection pressure for that to get more complex, to allow you to express more information, and that may produce or select for a better ability to use these kind of recursive abilities, which may mean that if they were present in a sort of simple and ancestral state in our last common ancestors with monkeys, for example, they may have still greatly improved in humans. So I think that, yes, those abilities are probably much more expanded in humans. They may be completely absent in monkeys, although I'm not willing to go all the way and say that categorically. But I think that monkeys don't have the symbolic language on which that operates that is what makes those abilities so important and so powerful in humans.
Right, yeah, so there's been a lot of focus on syntax as being, this goes back to Chomsky, this is the big difference, and so that's what we've got to explain, but you're suggesting maybe it's words, it's those units that we have and then recombine.
one of the differences, I struggle with the idea that there is only a single difference between humans and monkeys. And if they just had the gene for recursion or merge, or that allowed them to have these abstract concepts like words, then they suddenly, well, over a relatively short evolutionary period, start developing language in a similar sense to humans. I think, going back to the point I was making at the beginning, that there are maybe many different cognitive systems that are required for us to have language. I think monkeys probably have all of those to some extent, but not to necessarily the level where language starts being useful. And to maybe complete the thought I had at the very beginning of this, I mentioned things like syntax and semantics, but there are clearly other things that we need for language. These include things like theory of mind, right? Understanding that your mental representation of the world is different to mine, and therefore it is valuable for me to communicate information to you. Whereas if I didn't understand that, and I just assumed that everybody had the same understanding of the world as I have, there is a lot less motivation for communication. Also, things like, at least in the vocal domain, vocal learning and the ability to produce a large number of different words, for want of a better word, to give us the size of a vocabulary that we would need. Monkeys don't have that. They just don't have the laryngeal control to allow them to produce large numbers of vocalizations. You could maybe get around this by using something like a gestural or a manual language, a precursor to something like human sign language. And interestingly, if you look across different primate species, you see a rapid expansion, well, not necessarily that rapid, but over evolutionary time, manual dexterity becoming a lot more advanced as you move to apes compared to monkeys, compared to sort of more distantly related New World monkeys, which I think is very interesting. Another critical one which we've touched on is what is often termed form meaning mappings, and understanding that words or symbols or whatever correspond to other things out there in the real world. I think that it's possible and in fact probable that all of those different capacities exist at a lower level than in humans. In monkeys, they exist at a lower level than in humans. And I don't think adding any one of them would be sufficient to lead to the emergence of language. I think there is probably some critical point where all of those abilities, for reasons that may not have originally been to do with communication or language, reached a certain point that then kind of all of the boxes were ticked and the very most basic form of language could have evolved or emerged. And then from there, it can start to rapidly increase by cultural evolution. That's getting quite a long way from my actual research and into the realms of speculation. But I do sort of resist the idea that there is a single separating point between humans and non-human primates when it comes to an ability as large and complex as language.
Yeah, thanks. So you basically anticipated what was going to be my kind of wrap-up question, which was to ask you to engage in reckless speculation about human evolution. I mean, you said there's a lot of questions, and you're designing particular experiments to answer particular ones, and that's going to be a lot of work, and for you and the next generation and the next generation after that. But it's fun. Do you have a sort of a favored scenario for human language evolution? Is it gesture first, maybe you were alluding to? How would you see it?
So I've had conversations like this a lot, and I just find it such a huge question that it's difficult to answer. I think one of the things I find interesting about the language evolution world, the literature, is that I once gave a talk where I highlighted all of the different books that had been published in the last 10 years on the subject of language evolution. And it kind of just made an entertaining slide because there were dozens of them. There are so many people who have worked on this topic. And that isn't necessarily dozens of people who all have different opinions or disagree with each other. Often it was people answering different parts of the same question. So to maybe go back to where I started, my master's degree was in evolutionary psychology, and I was particularly inspired to do that course. It was the course founded by Robin Dunbar, who's an anthropologist from the UK. He's famous for the social brain hypothesis. This is the idea that as social groups in primates become larger, and it's beneficial to become larger for a number of reasons, including avoiding predation and various other reasons, it's necessary to maintain social bonds within that large social group. But maintaining social bonds is difficult and it's time consuming. Monkeys do it by way of grooming. They spend a lot of time grooming each other, and that reinforces the relationships between the individual animals. But you reach a certain point where there just isn't enough time in a day to groom all of the members of your troop. So at some point then groups split and fission, and you end up with a limit on the level of group size that you can get. his argument, and I think that there's some evidence for this, but again, it's not all easy to prove because it's evolutionary data. It's hard to find clear evidence for this, is that in human history, we moved from purely grooming as a method of maintaining social bonds to using some sort of vocal interactions. He talked about this in terms of gossip as a slightly later point within that evolutionary timescale, but that we just make vocal sounds that show social bonds towards each other. And you can do that in a larger group, and you can do it while your hands are free to do other things like forage for food. And that allows you to have more communication with more individuals at the same time, allowing you basically more time in the day to maintain those social bonds, have larger social groups. I think that the reason that that is really appealing to me, and that's obviously only the start of the evolutionary story, we went far further than that with language, and it becomes obviously a much more complex system. That's really appealing to me because it doesn't just explain language as a communicative system as we currently use it. It kind of starts to explain why it would have been adaptive before it was communicating any particularly useful information. At that stage, it was only really communicating, we're friends and I want to spend time with you. And that might sound trivial compared to how we use language now, but it's still so important in human social interactions. The work from Robin then went on, and he looked at other things like how that may have changed into something like communal song, maybe things like dance, because these are things that are very, very good for group unity. You get similar levels of sort of oxytocin release in things like communal singing as you actually get in manual touch, similar to what you would get released during grooming and things, and how that might have all built up. The idea being here, you have a species that has a huge desire for social interaction, for maintaining social bonds, and and they're also kind of inclined to communicate, maybe vocally, although I don't have any disagreement with the idea that some of language may have happened through a more sort of gestural route. And then from there, if you had those changes that I was talking about earlier, something that maybe allowed you as that kind of ancestral human to do these kind of form meaning mapping operations, if you suddenly did have some small change and now you were able to make some new word and it now corresponds to antelope or something, and you have the desire to communicate, you have a situation, a social situation where that's common, and now you can start adding meaning to that, that feels like a sort of plausible way that language kind of could have evolved. All of that is wholeheartedly speculation on my point. It's all much more recent in our evolutionary history than anything that I can study in monkeys. Well, except for possibly the grooming. The grooming is still there, but the transition from grooming to vocal interactions or gossip hasn't happened in any other species that we're aware of. But I think that that's quite a nice story. And then as we get closer to human language, there are a million theories as to why language would have evolved in the way it did. And I don't think that all of them, or even necessarily many of them, are mutually exclusive. And whether these are arguments about, well, language would have been selected for via sexual selection because those who are good at communicating may be more attractive to the females, and their children would therefore be more reproductively successful. Whether it was to communicate information about maybe hunting, gathering, those kind of information, those kind of situations, I think all of those could be very plausible, and unfortunately it goes far beyond my research to really be able to narrow down exactly which of those are correct.
Well, thanks for being willing to engage in some speculation. I know it always feels like you're kind of out there, you know, but it's a good way to generate ideas probably. So well, those were the questions I had to ask, but I did want to ask you if there's anything going on right now in your work or the field that you're particularly excited about that I didn't get a chance to ask you about.
It's also early stages, given that I've only just arrived here in Atlanta. Yes, there's lots of things that I'm really excited about. We've spent some time here talking about artificial grammar learning, but I think based both on the questions that you are asking and hopefully some of the answers that I've given, I think it's clear that I don't think that it's sufficient to answer all of the questions that I have about language evolution, and the differences between humans and other primates. So my main sort of excitement is starting to take other approaches and look at things like, well, are animals capable of forming something that looks a bit closer to a symbolic relationship, to try and understand that there are symbols with meanings, and can they use those in interesting ways? I'm interested in taking this in a slightly more social direction and looking at how animals might actually be able to use that information to interact with each other, because while you can get a lot of information from the sorts of approaches that we've used in the past, language is fundamentally used for communication, and the fact that we're not using it in a communicative setting with non-human primates, I feel, is missing at least some important insights. So can we convince, or can we design a setup in which animals can communicate using something like an artificial language? Another thing that I find fascinating about language, although it falls slightly more out of my area of expertise, is the way that languages themselves change with use over time. That you can start with a language in a laboratory setting, which is quite arbitrary, quite difficult to learn. And as that is used and passed between people, that language itself becomes simpler, more learnable, more expressive. So there's this interesting balance that we have a brain that is quite clearly shaped for language, but language is also shaped for our brain, and the interaction of how that works fascinates me. And I'm very curious about whether something similar could happen with non-human primates, because that would kind of ask interesting questions about whether or not the process of that cultural evolution of language kind of requires a language system itself, or whether it could happen based on more sort of natural principles, even in a non-linguistic species. I think that would be fascinating. And I'd also, given the availability of, or given the size of Yerkes Primate Center, I'm very interested in looking at how abilities in any of these kind of areas might relate to animals' actual own social interactions, their positions within the social structure, the dominant hierarchy in which they live, and whether you maybe see different demands on communicativeness or understanding or various other things between very dominant and very subordinate animals, between males and females, because there's obviously huge sort of sex differences in behavior in non-human primates, where you have small numbers of adult males and much larger numbers of females in a social group, and there are maybe different requirements in terms of maintaining social relationships within that structure. So there's a million questions that I think are fascinating, and I guess I didn't even mention how the brain supports any one of those is, again, interesting, important questions. So I have lots and lots of questions, but maybe if I talk to you in a year or two, I might have some more actual answers and some more data to back up any of these cool questions that I hope to be working on.
Yeah, that is a lot of cool questions. Sounds to me like, yeah, a real long-term research program you need to pursue there. I would love to talk to you again in a year and see how you're getting started on it, but I suspect it's going to take a while. Huh?
I won't have all the answers in a year.
Really, thank you very much for joining us today and for talking about your research. It was really great to learn about. And I'd like to thank also our audience for joining us on another issue of CMBC's Inside the Lab, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.